As well as adding lots of factions to Warhammer 40k, every so often Games Workshop chooses to reduce support, reinterpret, or reconfigure a faction, perhaps no longer giving it a full codex. With that treatment befalling Harlequins in early 10th edition, are there any other 40k factions that might be at risk? Hello and welcome back to Warsbets Tactics, where today I thought it would be interesting to do a thought experiment type video, talking through each faction in Warhammer 40k and how vital and safe they are within the setting and their miniature ranges, looking at which armies are the very safest from Games Workshop ever removing them or changing how they work, and which are the armies that are perhaps most at risk for this, if any. Before we start, I feel like this might be a slightly touchy subject for some people. I would put a small disclaimer to say that this is just a thought experiment video for entertainment purposes only. I'm sure I'll get at least some people saying down in the comments that Warsbets Tactics is trying to remove my faction or something like that, when that's really not the case. It's definitely very painful when Games Workshop decides to reduce support for an army that you might have collected, particularly when Warhammer armies take a massive amount of time investment, love and money. So no one's really going to want to see their creation in a worse shape than it was, whether that's lessened rule support, units disappearing, or even things being outright removed from the game as their own thing. I also don't really want this to be a video to encourage faction hate particularly. Not everyone likes every single army, and that's kind of fine. I don't think it really makes sense to give other people who do enjoy the factions a hard time about it. Still though, I was interested to find out what armies and factions the community felt were the most safe and perhaps the most expendable or peripheral to the setting, both in terms of lore and miniature ranges. I'm kind of more interested by the difference in perceptions as opposed to any real risk. I feel like the vast majority of 40k armies are very, very safe, and Games Workshop aren't going to be doing anything nasty to them anytime soon. With all that said though, let's get into it. The general idea is that Warhammer 40k does have a lot of factions, and Games Workshop do love to add more and more as time goes on, exploring new interesting things from the lore, and of course generating entire new armies to sell to us. No matter how big and well supported Games Workshop is, there will always be a limit to this. They can't just keep on releasing endless new factions and nothing give at all. In the past they have shown that they're not really afraid of pulling individual kits if they don't sell particularly well, things like Forge World Rangers, and some of the Firstborn Space Marine kits have been pulled depending on sales, and we have had plenty of factions losing full Codex status in one way or another over the past, Harlequins being the most recent example of this. With all that in mind, I thought it would be interesting to poll people on a couple of things: which armies people think would be the most at risk for losing Codex status, and also, as a related but actually kind of different question, I also asked people that if Games Workshop said that they had to drop 5 factions from Warhammer 40k, which ones would people prefer them to choose and why? I think that's a very different thing to the question as to thinking what Games Workshop might actually drop. As said, I do feel that the vast majority of core established factions are really quite safe in maintaining Codex status. It's more likely that if some of the more peripheral armies out there got reinterpreted, it'd probably be just flying the same army under a different flag, but I still think the question is an interesting one. Just for a few past examples of this before we get into the factions in general, this definitely is something that's happened before to a greater or lesser extent. Maybe the squats from a long time ago being the single most famous example. Really quite early on into 40k's history, Games Workshop just stopped supporting them and had their models go out of print. Not something that they've done for a really long time besides that. They tend to more mothball armies and just not give them much rules or lore support, as opposed to just completely can them outright. Realistically, if Games Workshop hadn't had quite as much expansion and had the time and resources to develop loads of new armies, they might well never have come back, as they did recently as the Leagues of Votann. Otherwise, perhaps the most recent obvious example are the Harlequins being folded into the Eldari Codex. It's not that you can't play the miniatures anymore and they still remain on sale, but losing full army support does mean that they don't have any unique detachment at the moment, and they do kind of feel like a suboptimal army within the Eldari range. As to field an Eldari army consisting of nothing but Harlequins, you're basically just taking out a bunch of units from your army for no real rules reason at least. I'd imagine they'll probably get some detachment support when the Eldari Codex comes out, but that hasn't happened yet. Losing full army support definitely means they'll have less rule support overall from Games Workshop and less attention. It has happened to other things in the past, like the Militarum Tempestus within the Imperial Guard, going from a full army mini support to some regiments in a Psychic Awakening supplement to basically just being units within the army now. Other examples might be the Scutarian Cult Mechanicus that originally had separate codexes, but that was a really weird decision at the time to be honest. The Khorne Demonkin faction, that seemed like Games Workshop might have been going down deity-specific books for the Chaos Marines and their demons, but then never went on with that. The Space Marine Codex chapters, things like Ultramarines and White Scars having their own books, though again I feel like there was some argument that that was kind of unnecessary and it should have really been in Core Codex Space Marines to start with. And then there are other examples over the past, things like Demon Hunters and Witch Hunters having their own codexes before being reinterpreted, the Lost and the Damned army list, several Forge World ranges such as Elysians or Death Corps having their own entire army support, and plenty of Warhammer Fantasy races that lost support when the setting changed to Age of Sigmar. Despite all these examples, I'd still say it's a rare thing overall, and if you have the miniatures for any of these, they still remain playable in one form or another, though maybe not quite in the way that you bought them to use them when their active codex or army list was out. Jumping into the factions of the setting though, and I thought we'd go through the order of least likely to get removed to most likely, at least by your vote, judging by the numbers on the top right of the screen here. Starting out, we have the biggest, best supported kind of old guard factions of Warhammer 40k. Armies that are absolutely firmly established both in lore and massive model support, and realistically pretty much no chance that these guys are ever going to get removed from the setting. Even out of these though, I thought it was interesting to see the discrepancies with what people voted. Space Marines were voted as the very least likely to ever be removed, and perhaps not too surprising given that they're the single most recognisable thing in Warhammer 40k. Though I did find it funny that they attracted a fair few votes on the ones that people would choose to remove if they were given the choice. I feel like that's kind of the protest vote against Games Workshop having them quite so central. Otherwise, Tyranids, Orcs and Necrons were the next least likely, along with Astra Militarum. All those were the least likely to be selected by factions people would choose to get rid of, around about 15 votes each. The Eldari were next, picking up slightly more, and I feel like out of these old guard factions, these guys feel a little bit more shaky than some perhaps. They do seem to be a bit less popular than most of these other factions these days, despite having tons of model support and being one of the more popular armies of 40k back in the more 90s sort of section. And it's kind of telling that they've still got models that date back to then. GW not having had anywhere near as much incentive to maintain their range sales-wise. It almost looked like they were going for trying to radically shift up the Eldari in 40k with the Inari announcement in 7th edition, though I feel like the vast majority of people didn't really have any enormous interest in them going down that sort of route in the story. I feel like it might have just shoehorned them into something a bit too linear perhaps, so now they just remain a quirk of the faction as opposed to something that's become more mainstream for them. These guys got a few more votes to remove them from the setting than some. I guess they do kind of have lore as a dying race, and again there might be a bit of an element of a protest vote there against them being quite so rampant and dominant in game at the moment. That always attracts a bit of ire. Otherwise, Chaos Space Marines were a little bit ranked under Eldari, again pretty much core to the setting really. And out of these staple factions, Tau Empire were the highest voted here with 10% on the likeliness to remove poll, and they got considerably more votes for a faction that people might choose to take out. Tau do seem to be one of the armies that attract some of the most faction hate, perhaps partly due to being a bit small on the scale of Warhammer 40k setting, and often tend to be one of the armies that seems to wind people up in game a bit with their ranged warfare and jump shoot jumping type tricks. Still though, zero chance that Games Workshop would ever remove them. They're a very popular faction in the game. They've got a ton of cool new models with more on the way it would seem. Moving onwards from the absolute staples of 40k, next up people voted the Sisters and Admech to be some of the most stable factions. These do feel like they've got a fair few similarities, fairly recent ranges within the setting, pretty good model support with multiple choices for each battlefield role now, staples of the setting and major armies in their own right, but perhaps not really feeling quite as absolutely sturdy compared with the most staple factions before. Adeptus Custodes had their long hiatus where Games Workshop basically didn't support them in any way and left them languishing with an ancient metal miniature range before they had their big plastic reboot. And the Adeptus Mechanicus were voted very slightly higher, both in terms of choices to go and likeliness. I feel like both of these armies do tend to have fairly low play rates compared with some of the previously mentioned factions, partly due to both of them being pretty expensive armies to collect, the Admech in particular. Sentiment for Admech armies does seem to be really quite low at the moment after their recent Codex announcement. Still though, with relatively chunky army ranges, I say these two are pretty much as safe as the previous ones mentioned. Next up, and also considered very safe, are the Chaos Divergent legions. Death Guard Thousand Sons and World Eaters, all given their own deities, and probably Emperor's Children on the way if this trend continues. These guys have a bit of variable support at the moment. Death Guard really have quite a lot of their own unique units, given them being the launch faction of 40k 8th edition. The Thousand Sons and World Eaters have a lot less unique stuff of their own. They all share a bunch of Chaos Space Marine units, and previously were just facets of the core Chaos Space Marine army before being developed in their own themes one after another. Again, given their own ranges and good player following, particularly for Death Guard, these all seem really quite unlikely to be removed. They were voted 18 to 20% on the likelihood here. I guess perhaps the biggest dangers of them not being just under their own codexes could be Games Workshop choosing to go a supplement style system like the Loyalist chapters have had for a while, or maybe some sort of god deity specific book where each of these might wind up in the same book as their Chaos Demon counterparts, perhaps similar to Khorne Demonkin, but it doesn't really look like this has been a route that Games Workshop's going, and they can just ally in demons from that book of their own faction. Within these, the Death Guard and the Thousand Sons were pretty much rated the same here by you guys. World Eaters just a little bit higher on the likelihood to go and more likely to get removed. I guess their miniature range does feel really quite underdeveloped without that many unique kits at all, plus being literally the newest army on the block in terms of full codex support right now. Around about the same level of these were the big three Divergent chapters for the Space Marines, Space Wolves, Blood Angels, and Dark Angels. These all go back a very long time in having their own standalone either supplement books or full codexes. Over the years it's flip-flopped between one or the other. In general, Games Workshop seems to think that they do have enough unique stuff of their own that they do need their own book. Otherwise, if you consolidated all of these into core codex Space Marines, it'd be even more ridiculously bloated than it already is. These guys certainly feel like the safest three out of the Divergent chapters compared with Black Templars and Deathwatch, who have often been just represented by core codex Space Marines or other rules, and their miniature ranges are quite a lot bigger than either of those. Compared with anything mentioned previous though, these guys did all get a lot more votes on the which army you would drop poll, over 200 for the Blood Angels and Dark Angels and more for the Space Wolves. I feel like a lot of people outside of Space Marine collections maybe feel that they're a bit more expendable, given that they do basically boil down to Marines of different colours with a few unique units of one sort or another. Having any sort of supplement codex system does also feel a bit painful and maybe not the best way that Games Workshop could do things. It's not really very nice to have to pick up two different books to collect one army, and maybe just makes them feel a bit extra compared with other armies in the game. For the breakdown out of these, Dark Angels were voted the least likely to go. I guess there's a lot of focus on them at the moment. What with their range reboots and everything, having a Primarch and plenty of reveals coming for them in the not too distant future is pretty big. Blood Angels were only very slightly above them, and Space Wolves were a bit more significantly above, at 23% of the likelihood to removal, and a lot more people choosing them as one of the ones that they'd get rid of. I feel like out of the three, Space Wolves are probably a little bit less collected than the other two. Their aesthetic is perhaps a little bit more divisive than the Blood Angels or Dark Angels, with lots of people really liking the range, but their Horse-based Vikings with a wolf fixation thing doesn't really appeal to everyone out there. Overall though, I really couldn't see any of these losing their unique supplements type status. It's not impossible they could get entire codex releases that stand alone in some sort of future edition of the game. They did have them previously, and that's what Games Workshop did with the Death Guard and Thousand Sons and things. Moving on, and they're voted around the same sort of level of safety as the previous, are the Adeptus Custodes. They were slightly higher voted on the choice to remove poll though, at 330 votes overall. Custodes do have a slightly smaller range outside of Forge World, and I feel like some of this might stem from the pushback against the idea of them being a standalone army that did happen when they came out. In the past, they were often just seen as this distant ultimate guardians of terror that never really left the throne world and didn't usually tend to engage on open war, and it often tended to act as more sort of emissaries and advisories to other armies. Perhaps partly because of developing their army, Games Workshop has changed things in recent lore though, and tried to make them a bit more adventurous out there in the galaxy. In responses to the survey though, there were a few people voicing opinions that they just felt like they should be a force that's allied to other forces, rather than a golden host in their own right. Out of newer armies that Games Workshop has developed though, the Custodes definitely have a huge following. They do have cool chunky models with a pretty distinct aesthetic, and they're one of the cheapest and easiest ranges to get into out of all of Warhammer 40k, which definitely helps them get collected more. Given that the Custodes are just very popular, I really can't see Games Workshop choosing to remove them anytime soon. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that they haven't decided to develop the range further given how popular they are, and how I'm sure quite a lot of Custodes players would jump at the chance to land some of their Forge World kits if they were turned into plastic. Maybe we'll see that sometime in the future alongside a Heresy release perhaps. Next up, and voted on a similar sort of level to remove as the Space Wolves were the Leagues of Votann, ranks 23% on the poll there, though they got really quite a lot of votes on the which faction would you drop poll, at 474 votes overall, 6th overall here. There will be a bit of irony to the squats having been out of production for so long, suddenly coming back and then Games Workshop immediately cancelling them, though kind of obviously that's not going to happen. I guess at the moment their range is pretty small with only a few kits supporting them, though still more unique stuff than say certain ones like World Eaters, at least in terms of model kits unique to their faction. As new factions in Warhammer 40k go, it really does seem like they have been pretty popular. Being the space wars of the setting, they do seem to have been embraced a bit more as one of the major armies of Warhammer 40k. I feel like in time they'll feel fairly natural to the setting in the same way as things like Tyrannies, Necrons, Eldar and Tau do. They feel like in their initial release periods, they do kind of feel like they're just not really very established, and they've been somewhat retconned back into the 40k lore. There has been a bit of a sense that Games Workshop's just kind of hand-waved it and said, oh, they've always been there, but you've just not really noticed, and they just happen to have not really cropped up in any other stories in the past in the last 20 years or so. In any case, though, I'd certainly not expect the kin to go anywhere, and I'd certainly expect another big release wave for them in 10th. Moving on, we have the Drukhari, an army that Games Workshop seems that they've really not supported to any extent for quite a long time now, only a couple of occasional releases like Incubi Drazar and Lilith Hesperax. Interestingly, these gained a pretty high vote on the likelihood of removal at 25%, but really quite a low vote on the which army would you drop poll. Drukhari are one of the well-established factions of Warhammer 40k, going back into the setting's distant past alongside Eldari and friends, though perhaps out of the long-established factions feel like they're one of the most peripheral to the setting, and certainly haven't been supported well in recent years at all. I guess people might have rated these so high on this list due to them being really quite a niche faction comparatively, with a very small player base compared with some of the other factions out there. That's probably not helped at the moment with some index rules that haven't been made very exciting, plus having a miniature range that's probably in even more of a sorry state than the Eldari's one. They do have a bunch of kits that got re-released around about 12 years ago, but they've got a good chunk of kits that are just missing from their range, things like Grotesques, Mandrakes, the Court of the Archon and more, quite desperately in need of a fairly major plastic release just to get them back to the status they were a little while ago. Overall, Drukhari do feel like they're one of the peripheral factions that Games Workshop doesn't really sell very many kits of, and have been a bit reluctant to give them too much love or design attention as a result. I remember reading that when they had their last big release of models come out, they did seriously consider whether they wanted to try and redesign the faction in a more major way and remake them with very different themes and styling, though they did decide to go the same way in the end and stick with the established lore and feel. Again, I wouldn't feel that they're in any serious danger of just going away wholesale, and fingers crossed their 10th edition book will come with a bit better model support for them, as they're really needing it right now. Voted the same as the Drukhari were the Grey Knights at a 25% on the likelihood of removal poll. Again, I feel like they might have picked up some votes here as being yet another flavour of Space Marines, though given that they do have very different units and a different way of doing things, I feel like they've got a lot more justification for them being their own army than plenty of other things out there. Though I feel like they might have attracted a few more votes on this poll due to Games Workshop not really giving them all that much support in their miniature range at any time recently. Their last two miniatures, I believe, were Castellan Crow and Grandmaster Voldus. In this new age of upscaled Primaris scale Space Marines, I feel like their infantry and Terminators are really wanting a bigger, badder update. I'm sure that plenty of players wouldn't mind a reinterpretation of the Dread Knight at some stage. They certainly do fight at company level in the lore, though I feel like quite a lot of the time you might more hear about one squad of Grey Knights turning up, and that might be quite enough to get the job done. It does feel a little bit odd that Imperial armies can't ally them in as such, as you might have been able to do in the past. As with pretty much all of these, I can't see Grey Knights actually going away entirely, though I feel like perhaps the biggest threat to them as a standalone faction will be some sort of consolidation in some sort of Agents, Inquisition or Demon Hunters type army book. Though again, I'd say it's far more likely that they'd just be remaining their own thing ongoing, and one of these years Games Workshop will get around to redoing their army range and style, kind of like they did with the Black Templars. I'd say that's more a matter of when, not if, though it could be further in the future than Grey Knights collectors might like. Speaking of the Black Templars, compared with the Space Wolves, Blood Angels and Dark Angels, these guys were voted more likely to lose Codex supplement support and were also gaining more votes than the Space Wolves by quite a considerable margin. 440 votes there and a lot more than the Space Wolves got. I feel like this is probably because the Black Templars just don't have as big of a history of having their own individual supplement codex book. They have had one in the past and then got consolidated within core Codex Space Marines, then got to be a Psychic Awakening supplement before having some digital index rules and eventually an actual supplement release alongside their revamped miniature range. I guess the reasons for the selections here might be that it probably would be really quite possible for Games Workshop to consolidate them back into Codex Space Marines at some stage in the future, though it obviously wouldn't be this edition as we already have the Codex Space Marines book. Compared with Blood Angels, Dark Angels, and Space Wolves, which have a lot of datasheets, the Black Templars would probably get away with just 5 to 6 datasheets. I feel like realistically we're kind of likely to lose the Firstborn Crusader squad when that next gets updated, and then their unique gear for their Castellan and Marshals and unique tanks could just be war gear choices that only they can take, as opposed to actually needing their entire full datasheets. Overall, just putting an extra 5 character and squad datasheets into Codex Space Marines just feels a lot more doable, or the Space Wolf special characters and unique units, or the same for the Dark Angels and friends. Again, though, seems pretty much no chance of happening in 10th edition at the very least, given that we know that Codex Space Marines is what it is, and there's absolutely zero chance they wouldn't get some good supporting game given their very snazzy miniature range. Having really quite nice primary sculpts for their models has certainly attracted a bunch more people to their faction. I'd say they're far more at risk from their method of being played being changed to within the Space Marine Codex or some sort of consolidated supplement book, but will still be able to be fielded as their own faction in their own right. Next up, and moving up the numbers list, voted 29% on the removal poll were the Genestealers, and they also gained very slightly more votes than a few of the other things on the which faction would you drop poll. Voted the 4th highest out of the 26 major factions in Warhammer 40k. It's kind of interesting that they both got a higher likelihood to removal and choice of faction to drop than the recently released Leagues of Votann. Kind of says a bit about fan reaction to both of those factions in game, and perception of what can or should happen to them. Genestealer Cults are certainly one of the more recent armies to come out in 40k, and have had somewhat similar support to armies like the Admech and Sisters of Battle, maybe a few less model kits, but not really significantly far behind. They can also make use of Brood Brothers units from the Imperial Guard. I'd say that perhaps more so than a few of the other armies out there though, the Genestealer Cults have just been a very niche army that haven't been taken up by that many people out there. Compared with, say, Sisters, Custodes, or Imperial or Chaos Knights, they just don't really feel like they're collected in the same sort of numbers. Though in recent years, Games Workshop have generally made them tempting with at least interesting and fun game mechanics, and I feel like their current Combat Patrol box set does actually really help them out. They make what's usually a very expensive faction a bit more palatable to collect in numbers. In general, I feel like the Genestealer Cults are maybe a bit more niche in appeal than some of the major armies out there. Just from general internet chatter, I feel like their mining aesthetic plus mutant alien look is just not quite as appealing to everyone. Obviously, plenty of people absolutely love it, but I feel like there's probably an above average amount of people who get slightly turned off by the looks of the miniatures. As well as that, they feel like as a faction in Warhammer 40k, they just don't really feel on the same sort of level as a bunch of the other big players. They kind of feel a bit more like you'd imagine an antagonist faction that the big armies might be fighting against, but don't generally tend to have any absolutely enormous dreams of conquest besides just one planet, and their eventual endpoint seems to be just to seed the way for Tyranid invasion, so if the Genestealer Cults win, they kind of all get eaten anyway. I feel like between those two it might be a reason for why they haven't been embraced quite as widely as some out there, even if I think they are a really interesting army and certainly fun to play. I do have a medium-sized army of them myself. Realistically, with the new plastic range, I don't think that they're going to go away, even if my guess is that Games Workshop probably isn't selling as many of these as some of their other new kits that they've come out with. I really wouldn't be too surprised though if they're one of the armies that Games Workshop just doesn't make massive efforts to expand their army further on, and they might be left in a somewhat similar state to how they are now for a while. I guess we'll see though. I'm sure they'll get some bits and bobs, and I'm sure their codex will add a bunch more interest to playing them. Next up, and voted 4th out of the major factions of 40k, we have the Chaos Demons. You guys gave them a 30% vote on the chance to remove them, and similar sort of ratings on the which one would you drop poll. Demons do perhaps occupy a bit of a weird space in Warhammer 40k, the direct manifestations of the Chaos Gods, and as a result basically feel like fighting with a fantasy army against sci-fi factions with guns, though admittedly that does feel very Warhammer. As most of their miniatures are shared with Age of Sigmar, they don't really have much nods to future technology, besides things like the Soul Grinder, and maybe occasional other nods like the Primaris Lieutenant that you can mount on the base of Be'lakor. In the distant past, Chaos Demons were part of Codex Chaos Space Marines, and you could field them as lesser demons and greater demons summoned in, and then they became their own thing, more greatly fleshed out in their own codex, without unsettling, deep striking rules for the entire army. I guess theoretically you could combine them with the Chaos Space Marine Codex once more, though given the current amount of datasheets they have, that would make for an impractically large book, larger than the current Codex Space Marines is now. Or again, Games Workshop could go down the route of trying to separate them off by deity if they really wanted to, making books like Khorne Demonkin or similar things for Death Guard or Thousand Sons and things, though that does seem kind of unlikely given the way that they've been Chaos Demons in their own rights for a very long time now and haven't really changed on that regards for long. The fact that you can play them in Age of Sigmar and 40k is perhaps not a massively reassuring thing, I guess. GW does seem to be trying to keep their game systems as separate as possible for some reason, removing things like the Horus Heresy Dreadnoughts from Warhammer 40k, and I feel like they're maybe trying to make the Chaos Demons a bit more separate in the two settings by more deity focus on the Age of Sigmar side of things. For their lore and feel, I feel like they're unlikely to go away from the 40k setting, basically representing what happens when you have a horrific demon incursion into real space, and they do have a very extensive miniature range, maybe a bit bloated on the HQ side of things, 4 mini armies in one. I do kind of feel like they could probably profit from more actual troops and unit datasheets and slightly less HQs though. It does seem to be a bit skewed that way. Again, despite their high vote here, I feel like they're kind of unlikely to ever become not a thing in 40k. Their big miniature range just seems a bit impractically unlikely to be rolled into Chaos Marines, and you'd have to do fairly brave things with reshaping the deity books if you wanted to split them up by faction, and that would probably anger anyone who did collect the current faction if they suddenly said that you weren't able to use the army as a contained whole anymore. Just seems a bit unlikely. Next up, we've got a couple of armies that I'm not really too surprised were voted fairly high on this, the Imperial Knights and the Chaos Knights. They were voted 32% on the likelihood poll and quite massively ahead of the other choices on the which armies would you drop poll. The Imperials got 682, the third out of them. Since they came about as their own thing, Knights have certainly felt like an oddball faction in Warhammer 40k, an entire army of super heavy walkers with their armiger support, and for all the people enjoying their big stompy robots, there was definitely a certain amount of pushback to when they first came about as their own thing. Perhaps more than just about any army in the game, they don't really play in the same way as other armies out there. A bit of a power trip of big stompy and shooty robots to just bludgeon the enemy army to death. There's often a bit of a sense that it's a bit of a stat check as to how much anti-tank weapons you took in your army, and whether you did or not could determine the game. Though over 9th and 10th edition, I feel like Games Workshop have done well to make them a bit more interactive. Their objective play rules maybe make a bit more sense now, and for the most part they do seem to make them at least fairly externally balanced. They still maybe don't feel quite as interactive as some other armies out there. I'm saying that as a Knight player myself. It can just make certain units in your opponent's army feel a bit irrelevant in the game if they're only really good at skirmishing with lighter infantry and things. I feel like the majority of Knight players out there likely have a second army that they also play, just for a bit of variety for themselves. I guess compared with other armies, their miniature range is pretty small in terms of kits, though that's partly because you only need so many Knights to make an army. I feel like with how popular they are to add people's collections, their kits aren't going away. I guess the greatest threat would be whether they'd be reinterpreted in some way. From a long time ago, at least some people have had the idea that they should be limited to either allies, or big super heavy Titanic units shouldn't really be in standard 40k at all, and more limited to really big games. And to be fair, Knights maybe feel like one of the armies that don't scale quite as well, feeling a bit strange at lower points levels in particular. I feel at the moment though it's kind of hard to argue that they just entirely don't work within 40k, given that both Imperial and Chaos Knights have broadly tended to be at least fairly well balanced over the past couple of editions, having their place within the meta, but Games Workshop capable of adjusting their points costs and things if they got too dominant. I guess for theories about how they might be reinterpreted, you might be able to smash both of the Knights Codexes together for both Imperials and Chaos. That does feel like it could be fairly doable within the confines of a codex that's the same size as other factions, just given their amount of datasheets. It maybe does seem unlikely though, given that Games Workshop want to give them their own flavours and keep things as different as possible. Plus they now do have some units that just have genuinely different war gear, things like certain War Dog loadouts or the Knight Abominant. I guess another option could be to have some sort of combined codex with Mechanicus. I'm sure certain Mechanicus armies really would quite like the option to ally Knights in a bit easier. Again though, doesn't really seem super likely to happen. Despite really quite high voting here, I really would be surprised if Knights go anywhere. They're pretty popular and widely played and big fun models. Probably not the miniatures that you want to be playing with and against literally every single game for most people, but kind of fine I'd argue, while they're only taking up one part of the overall player pool and aren't just completely dominant for any reason. I won't say too much about the Chaos Knights, as most of the same points apply to them. Kind of interesting to note that they were voted slightly higher than the Imperials, both on the likelihood and the which would you drop polls. I guess they've got even less truly unique kits than the Imperials, given that a lot of their range is just using reinterpretations of those ones. They haven't been around quite as long, and for a while they were just represented by a digital rule set with Renegade Knights. Again, I suppose they could get merged with the Imperials, or I suppose get reinterpreted as some sort of Chaos Allies type thing. Though again, despite high voting here, I think they're really unlikely to go away. Fairly popular as a different way to play Warhammer 40k with some big power trip robots, and some really quite cool recent plastic kits. Finally though, we come to the faction that was voted as the single most likely to get removed from Warhammer 40k, and also really quite dominant on the which army would you drop poll if people were forced to choose 5. I can certainly see why people would nominate the Deathwatch for this, out of the Space Marine Divergent chapters that people are a little bit skeptical of anyway. I do feel like perhaps the most peripheral of these, and I do feel that for a few different reasons, I think. Out of 40k factions, they're at least relatively recent that they came about as their entire army that you could field 100% of, emerging at a similar sort of time to the Genestealer Cults and Harlequins, the Harlequins now notably being one of the factions that got consolidated within Eldari. In the lore and background, perhaps similar to the Harlequins, the Deathwatch do feel like an army that often tend to more operate as single kill teams or really quite small strike forces as opposed to entire armies with access to the entirety of the Space Marine arsenal, though it certainly does happen. Their miniature range also feels more in jeopardy than the other Space Marine chapters as well. The Black Templars have a kind of similarly small range to them, but they've received a recent Primaris update, whereas the Deathwatch are all just firstborn miniatures with their veterans Corvus Blackstar, Cassius Kill Team and the Watchmaster, plus upgrade sprues to give Primaris their shoulder pads. They actually had their Captain Artemis miniature removed, presumably due to low sales despite being a recent plastic miniature. And the Primaris kill teams also maybe feel like they're not the most stable of 40k miniatures. Anything that doesn't get directly sold in boxes by Games Workshop is far more open to interpretation of how they choose to realise the rules for them than most, and they have shifted the way that you can field these Primaris kill teams in additions, showing that they can reinterpret them if they want to. Perhaps the same as the other Divergent chapters, the firstborn miniatures do seem to be on the agenda for either replacement or removal at some stage. I feel like they'd be more likely to wait and replace them when they get round to them, though certain low-selling things have been taken away in the past, such as the big firstborn range, including things like the Thunderfire Cannon and Hunter and Stalker. And out of the ranges of 40k, Deathwatch do seem to be one of the lowest-selling and least-played 40k armies, with Harlequins now a thing of the past as their own standalone army. I would probably guess that the Deathwatch are the least played faction out of the other 26 major ones. Even having said all that, I'd be surprised if you couldn't field a Deathwatch force in some way in 40k's future, and I still say that odds on just to get the exact same Codex supplement treatment as it looks like the rest of the Divergent chapters will get. But I would agree with the rest of the internet here that the Deathwatch seem like that if Games Workshop were to remove an army, they would probably be the first choice. Perhaps doing some sort of consolidation with them and the rest of the Inquisition. They could bring them into a bit more of an Agents of the Imperium type rule if they really wanted to. Or again, given their very low unit count, just literally have them consolidated within Codex Space Marines when it next rolls around. Give them a detachment within the Codex, and just print their datasheets alongside the rest of Codex Space Marines. I'm not saying it's necessarily likely that they could be removed, but I feel like they're more at risk than most, and I could see a couple of obvious ways in which they could be reinterpreted, even if they do still have the same models that you can play with. And again, similar to the Grey Knights, I feel like it's a question of when, not if, they get a Deathwatch Primaris kill team upgrade, and perhaps get a range refresh similar to how the Black Templars did. Let me know what you think though. Are the Deathwatch actually really at risk of Games Workshop removing them from the game? Or do you think that they'll just be kept along as a minor faction with supplement codex support and get a couple of model releases as and when? In any case, as mentioned at the start of the video, I feel like in reality, literally all of these are odds on to stay. I did even include the Deathwatch in that, despite being a bit shakier than some. I did find it interesting what people thought were the more bedrock factions of 40k and the ones that feel more peripheral or will be missed less than others if they went away. But let me know your thoughts and ideas on the interpretation down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.